Welcome and hello everyone. Welcome to the 5 tips for supporting your researchers using Altmetric. We're really happy that you can join us today. My name is Liesa Ross and I'm the Director of Market Development for the Americas for Altmetric. I'll be in the background running the webinar today, fielding your questions and hopefully doing a good job of troubleshooting any technical issues that may come up. Hopefully that won't be any, but you never know with these online presentations. My colleague, Patty Smith, is going to walk us through 5 easy ways you can use Altmetric, explore for institutions to help be of even more service to the researchers at your institutions and organizations. As a librarian, Patty knows firsthand the demands of your role and the time constraints you often face, and how vital what you do is to the success of your researchers' work and the institutional recognition. But before we begin, what we're going to cover is a little housekeeping. Patty's going to go over the tips to support researchers, and then we'll have time at the end for some Q&A. The webinar is being recorded. All attendees are currently muted. If for some reason you notice that you are not, please mute yourself, or I may notice that later. If you have any technical issues, please send me a private chat for support. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box. If you don't see a question box, you can use the chat box as well, but I prefer the question box. I can keep track of whose questions have been answered or not, and we can also keep them there to administer the Q&A at the end. And just a note that all attendees will receive a link to the recording tomorrow, and the registrants. If someone wasn't able to join, they'll also get a link for the registration, for the recording. So now I'm going to hand things over to Patty. One second. Bear with me 1 minute, please. Here we go. And Patty will give us our tips.
All right, thank you, Liesa. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, good. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. As Liesa mentioned, my background is in librarianship. So prior to joining Altmetric in March of 2019, I worked as a hospital librarian in Chicago before then moving on to Northwestern University's Galter Health Sciences Library, working as a research impact librarian. So it was at Northwestern where I really started to learn about bibliometrics and alternative metrics and get interested in that area. Scholarly communication, the whole deal. And so today I'm going to talk to you about these 5 different tips, and these are all questions that researchers asked me during my time at Northwestern. So hopefully you'll find some of them useful. So we have 5 tips today, half an hour webinar, so we're going to go through them at a pretty quick clip. But if you have any questions and want to learn more about any of these tips, you can always let me know, and we can have a greater conversation about them. But as you can see on the slide today, we have a brief overview of the 5 tips we're going to go over. So we're going to learn how you can support researchers using altmetric data by providing 1, analytics to strategically decide where to publish scientific findings. 2, promotion and tracking of research outputs beyond journal articles. 3, early feedback on the broad attention the research is receiving online. 4, evidence of collaboration with peers and institutions. And then 5, narratives of the reach and impact of their work. So jumping into tip 1 here, so publishing strategically and discovering journals in specific subject areas that receive broad attention. So where should I publish my research is a question that I did not ever expect to receive when I first started working in a library. And I thought that researchers would know relevant journals much better than I would. But the truth is there are so many journals out there and so many predatory journals these days too, that there's really no way that our faculty and researchers can keep track of all of the journals in their discipline. Sure, they're going to know the big names in their fields, but not every paper is going to be published in a Nature or in a Science, for example. So you can use Altmetric Explorer to discover relevant journals in different fields that receive broad attention online. So one way that you can do this is by hopping into Altmetric Explorer and going to the advanced search bar. And you'll see here we have the options up in the upper right-hand corner to choose my institution only or the full Altmetric database. In this case, we're kind of doing a bit of a landscape analysis of a certain field to see where things are commonly published. So we're going to take a look at the full Altmetric database. And then we're going to use the subject search bar. It says subjects for classification, and the FOR stands for field of research, the field of research codes. So we can start typing in a field of research into the search bar, and suggestions will start to auto-populate underneath. So we can see we have biochemistry, cell biology, evolutionary biology, microbiology, so all of these different fields of research. And so this field of research classification system is actually a very specific and powerful classification system. It was developed in Australia, and these codes are assigned at the paper level, not at the journal level. So it's really great for interdisciplinary research, et cetera. So it's a very specific classification system. So you can work with your researcher to decide, which subjects might be the most relevant to start out this search. So in this case, I ended up choosing evolutionary biology to search. So then when I click search, I can start to explore where this research is being published. So if I toggle over to the journals tab, I can see over on the left-hand side, the column, the journal/collection, I can see where this evolutionary biology subject area research is most frequently published and receiving broad attention online. So it defaults to sorting by the total number of mentions, but you can, any of these headers up at the columns here, you can toggle with these and choose to sort by news mentions, blog mentions, policy mentions, et cetera, to see which journals are receiving the most attention in those different areas. We can see we have PLOS ONE, bioRxiv, Zootaxa, going on down the line. So there's many, many more beyond just this screenshot. And as always, any of these tabs, you can export the tabs to a CSV file to do further custom sorting and analysis. You could approach this from a different way as well. So if I go back to the advanced search bar, perhaps the researcher is interested in where their colleagues and their peers at their institution are publishing. Maybe they're an early career researcher and they kind of want to know where their mentors are publishing most frequently. So in that case, we would actually choose to search for my institution only and look at publications only from your institution. We can keep in that same subject classification of evolutionary biology, and then look at the verified department. So in this case, the School of Natural Sciences, where that researcher belongs, and then kind of do the same thing to see where their colleagues are publishing most frequently. And then I should note that you can also use the same strategy to kind of do a broader landscape analysis. So do a search using a field of research classification, and then see, instead of looking at the journals where they're published, see where people are talking about this field online. So take a look at blogs, news outlets, certain Twitter users or influencers that are very vocal about these different research areas. And so that can help your researchers with strategic dissemination and perhaps any blogs they should be following, any Twitter users they should be following if they want to get more strategic with their dissemination process. Okay, tip 2, tracking diverse outputs and kind of getting credit where credit is due, tracking outputs beyond journal articles and discovering subsequent attention. So Altmetrics can be tracked for potentially any digital research output, not just journal articles. So our researchers and ourselves, librarians, create so much more than just papers, and they should get credit for that. And additionally, there are people involved in all phases of the research process, but not everyone gets credit if they aren't an actual author on that final paper. So we're talking about slide decks and data sets, curricula, posters, images. There's so many things that go into the research process where people currently might not be getting credit for it because there's no way to track those alternative research outputs beyond journal articles. I think librarians can really help facilitate conversations about the importance of tracking diverse outputs because oftentimes librarians are heavily involved in managing institutional repositories. And if you don't have an institutional repository, you can always promote other repositories like Figshare. But we can see on the screen here, so I took a screenshot of, I was actually using this strategy myself when I was working as a librarian at Northwestern. So in this case, you can see a screenshot of this slide deck that I presented at a conference. So before I actually even went to this conference to present, I uploaded my slides to our digital hub, which is our institutional repository at Northwestern Medicine. So I uploaded it, I added metadata, it received a DOI, and then I added a bit.ly link to this page to my slide deck. So then when I got up on stage at the conference, I was able to point people, before I even started my presentation, I was able to point people to my slides so they could view them in real time, share them in real time, etc. You can tweet about your presentation while you're at the conference using the conference hashtag. So you can be strategic about how to get people interested in your work and these non-traditional outputs. So then we can see that in the lower left-hand corner, we had the Altmetric badges embedded into our institutional repository, and I can view in real time how my presentation was then received. So it ended up that I had 29 tweets from 24 unique users. I was getting immediate feedback on my slides. People really liked my slides. I was able to inform future presentations because of this response. I can see that people are directing others to the slide deck. I got really great networking opportunities at this conference because of this engagement, in this case on social media. So it's really great for your researchers if they do this sort of thing in the strategic dissemination. And also we can monitor sentiment. So did my presentation spark any debate or any larger conversations? So that's really good for researchers as well who want to monitor the sentiment around how these non-traditional outputs are received. So I think this is a really great way you can promote your institutional repository and Altmetric together to kind of get the hook in. So I know that oftentimes with institutional repositories, it can be pretty tough to get people to upload things, especially those non-traditional outputs, because people don't always view them as contributions to science necessarily, because they're not getting credit for them. But this is a great way to show them that, yes, you can actually track how people are using your work and then demonstrate, perhaps in CVs, tenure and promotion materials, how your non-traditional outputs are impacting science. Okay, tip 3, view early feedback and using altmetrics to discover attention that research is receiving online in real time. So this one you are probably familiar with, but citations can take a very long time to accrue. It can take 2 to 5 years for citations to start to accrue on papers that are published, depending on the discipline. Whereas altmetrics offer immediate feedback about how people are engaging with your research outputs. So I think this is especially useful for engaging with early career researchers. So it takes a really long time to do research and a really long time to publish research. And so early career researchers probably only have a handful of these traditional research outputs in their portfolio. So you can use altmetrics to help them develop a broader narrative about the quote unquote impact that their work is having. So it's a little bit easier to form a story around that impact of their work. In the same line, it's also useful for demonstrating the impact of recently published work to funders and grant applications and renewals. So oftentimes you'll have to give quarterly updates to funders about what's going on with this grant that you received. I've even heard monthly updates to funders, which is pretty crazy, but I've heard it. So you can use Altmetric to track those early findings that you're receiving of how people are engaging with the work to demonstrate that to funders. And I should note that funders are using Altmetric as well. Not all of them, obviously, but some of the bigger ones will probably know what Altmetric is and what the score means and all of that, and the greater context surrounding alternative metrics. You can also use this early feedback to highlight successes in real time. So this is I think this is great for researchers themselves if they're really tracking the dissemination of their work, or if the department really wants to track the dissemination of their researchers' work. But it's also really great for communications and marketing on campus. So you can kind of give kudos to research that's being highlighted in the news or in important blogs, et cetera, in real time. So one way you can go about discovering the recent attention that research has received is by, you can craft a certain search strategy in the advanced search using a keyword or field of research code, or searching for a specific researcher or department, and then going to the research outputs tab and simply sorting by publication date newest first. So then the most recently published works will float up to the top. You can kind of scan through those to see which papers might be getting a lot of attention recently. Another way you can do this is always in the advanced search area. There's a publication date limit where you can pick the calendar dates that you want to look at. So either of these options are a good way to kind of get started on viewing early feedback of recently published work. Okay, tip 4, tracking collaborative efforts between institutions. So collaboration is a pretty hot topic for a lot of people these days, and Altmetric Explorer allows you to easily track the attention and successes of those collaborative efforts. So to quickly and easily view outputs that your institution has published with another institution, we're going to go back into the advanced search box, and we're going to look at my institution only. And then we're going to choose an affiliation, a university, an institution that we're interested in the collaboration with. So in this case, I typed in University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And again, as you start typing into the affiliation box, results and suggestions will auto-populate, so you don't always have to type in the full name. And so once I run the search of my institution with Michigan, I will see that all my research outputs with Lilliput University affiliated with University of Michigan, and we have 311 outputs with attention that we have collaborated on and published together. So then I can go in there and see, where they're being published, the different attention and mentions and engagement surrounding this collaborative effort. And if I wanted to share the report that I find with the University of Michigan, I can create a shareable report, email that off to them, and say, hey, look at the successes of our collaborations that we have together. Perhaps we should collaborate more often in this area, for example. But kind of on the flip side, a bonus tip with this is you can use the same strategy to discover competitive insight and track your peer institutions and what kind of attention they are receiving. So this is something that I was asked at Northwestern to do sometimes, was we want to know how are our peer institutions performing? Where are they publishing? What kind of attention are they getting compared to the attention that we're getting? And this could be coming from, a research office, it could be coming from a dean, et cetera. So much higher up the food chain than I was, but it's a great way to get involved with some of those parties. For example, you might get asked this to prepare for, an alumni presentation, to ask for funding from alumni to demonstrate how well your university is performing compared to your perceived peer institutions. So to do this, I would look at the full Altmetric database, because we don't want to look at our institution only. We're looking at the full database. And then again, I'm going to just type in the affiliation that I'm interested in, the university that I'm interested in looking at, and perhaps I want to provide other limits as well. So if I want to check out what they're doing in evolutionary biology, et cetera, in a certain area, I can run that search and discover where those conversations are happening online, where they're being featured in the news, where they're publishing, et cetera, compared to our publications. And I will note that, so you can search more than one university at a time. So you can put in multiple affiliations, but it will default to I shouldn't say default. The only option is to search them OR'd together. There's no option to search them AND'd together. So just keep that in mind if you want to search for multiple institutions. Okay, so that brings us to tip 5, informing narratives. So this one will be a little bit longer of a tip, and I'll walk you through an example. So I found that a lot of researchers have a very tough time putting the impact of their work into words and describing that impact. And that's true for both bibliometrics and alternative metrics together. They have a tough time putting it into words. But when would a researcher actually need to do this? And the easy answer is really anytime they need to demonstrate the impact of their their research. So this could be in a CV or promotion and tenure dossier, could be in a grant application or a funding renewal, could be for a job application, or even just on a departmental website. So I've seen a few examples of different departments having sort of a research impact section on their website. So you might have to craft some narrative surrounding research impact in that sort of case. So now I'll just kind of walk you through what this might look like. So our example scenario is a researcher asks you to help them highlight the impact of their work for a grant application. So what they're probably going to do is they're going to say, hey, I have these 10 papers that I am citing in this grant application. Can you tell me how impactful they are, or what's the impact that they've had? It's probably the language that they will default to using. So you take those 10 publications, use Altmetric Explorer to search for those research outputs and start building context around how people and organizations are using and discussing their work. So I would consider starting with policy mentions, mass media mentions, patent mentions, and social media mentions. We have 17 different channels of attention that we track at Altmetric, but I find that these 4 are a good place to start and really resonate with researchers. So I'll walk you through this example paper that I found. So the paper is oral administration of morphine versus ibuprofen to manage post-fracture pain in children. So this paper was actually cited by multiple policy documents, but I picked out this one policy document from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. So the policy guideline is fractures, assessment, and management. And the review question that they posed within this guideline was, what is the most effective initial acute pharmacological management to alleviate pain in patients with suspected fracture in acute care settings? So they addressed adults and children in this guideline. This paper was specifically about children, so I can dive into the policy guideline and find how this paper was actually used to inform this guideline. So we see that this paper was rated as moderate quality evidence across the board. So that was actually very good. Most of the other papers cited in this guideline were rated as low quality evidence. So moderate quality evidence was a definite good thing in this case. And then I can see the recommendations resulting from this particular guideline. So the recommendation for children is to offer oral ibuprofen for both mild to moderate pain. And so that recommendation is directly in line with what this paper recommends in this randomized trial. So moving on to the mass media attention surrounding this particular paper, was it received in the news? So you can see that the article on the left was originally from Reuters, but was also shared on Life Parenting from HuffPost. So we're targeting a very specific population, parenting population, parents, and getting the word out about the effectiveness of ibuprofen. It's just as effective as morphine. So, don't default to letting the doctor give your child morphine if ibuprofen will be sufficient. That goes right in line with the journal article on the right from Mother Jones about prescribing opioids and the overprescription of opioids, which is obviously a very hot topic over the last few years. And then finally, the research was also cited in this blog post and podcast, Emergency Medicine Cases. So, and this was a pretty cool resource that I found. So it seems to be a really great resource for clinicians, offering diagrams and examples of how to implement the findings from this particular paper. And so great clinical resource. So a lot of diverse ways this paper was cited in the news and different media. Then finally, take a look at social media attention. So oftentimes, social media is not always the best place to go to find evidence of impact, because people view it as just kind of like, oh, social media, it doesn't carry a lot of weight. But sometimes you can find really great conversations on social media like Twitter. So in this case, we have all these experts and big voices who are retweeting this, sharing that this is a practice-changing paper. So we have Carolyn Bennett, who is a member of Parliament in Canada. So she is a very vocal person, has close to 50,000 followers. Many people were exposed to this paper and the recommendations. We have Dr. Gill and Dr. Coffey, who are both physicians among a long list of other qualifications at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. And then, of course, we have the University of Alberta Pediatric Program Twitter saying that this is a practice-changing paper as well. So a lot of people, experts, agreeing that this is a very important paper and disseminating that message to wider audiences beyond academia. So how do I turn all of that context into a narrative? So when I help researchers do this, I like to keep in mind a few key considerations. So who is benefiting from the research? So thinking beyond the academic community, who is this research actually impacting? When and where are these conversations taking place? So mentioning, the news outlets that are featuring this work, or who on Twitter and that sort of thing. And kind of the greater so what question, what are the greater implications? You don't have to answer all of these questions while forming a narrative, but I think they're good to keep in mind. So I'll take a look at an example blurb that I wrote about this context that I found using Altmetric Explorer. So this work informed non-complex fracture guidelines from the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, recommending that pediatric patients receive ibuprofen to manage mild to moderate pain. More broadly, this research has influenced conversations in mass media surrounding opioid addiction. It has also been described on social media as practice-changing research by clinicians and government officials, evidencing the dissemination of this work to audiences beyond academia. So you're not going to be able to necessarily have this long of a blurb all the time. Sometimes you might need to pick and choose which points of this paragraph you would help the researcher use. So for example, maybe it's in their CV for their promotion and tenure dossier, and beneath each citation, they might want to include, this paper was cited by this many people and was also featured in 20 news articles, including the New York Times or something like that. So you might have to winnow this down to the appropriate context for whatever they need to use this with. But I found that I use this more paragraph format for maybe a website or a grant application. So in the United States for NIH biosketches, this would be the type of thing that I would help a researcher write to enhance their biosketch, or this could be something to be used for the ref in the UK, something sort of like this. So just to get your mind working around what a narrative might look like and how you can use altmetrics to do that. And you'll notice that in this paragraph, I did not use any numbers at all. So really moving away from using numbers and creating that qualitative information about how research is being used. So some final thoughts before we move on to some Q&A. So I really think you can use Altmetric Explorer to build rapport and provide proactive support to your researchers in the library. So I previously worked as a liaison librarian and as a reference librarian, research librarian, a lot of different titles. But I think I was always thinking about, how can I engage with my researchers, my different departments that I'm responsible for, always looking for something new, some new way to engage with them. So one thing you could do is proactively track researchers or departments that you really want to get a foot in the door with, and use the shareable reports feature within Altmetric Explorer as a way to start that discussion. So maybe you could set up a weekly or monthly alert for these different departments you want to start a conversation with, and then share that report with them saying like, hey, have you seen the recent successes that your department's work has had? Take a look at these altmetrics, like let's have a conversation about it. Another thing you could do is to feature interesting recent attention in a newsletter or library website. So for example, I would do a research roundup every year with our Northwestern's newsletter, kind of similar to the Altmetric Top 100, if you're familiar with that, except much smaller. We would do a research roundup of the papers that received a lot of diverse attention in the previous year and present that to faculty. And that started a lot of really good conversations with different departments about, hey, what are these altmetric things, and about bibliometrics as well. Another thing you could do is offer an intro class covering altmetrics and bibliometrics, sort of a demystifying metrics intro class, because I found that on campus there were people who obviously knew what citation-based metrics were, like the H-index. Maybe they had heard about altmetrics, but they didn't really know how to use them, why you would use them, and really didn't know much beyond like that they existed. So I created an introductory course covering bibliometrics and alternative metrics and responsible metrics and how to use them appropriately in CVs, biosketches, and that sort of thing. So that's another thing you can do. And again, that led to really great conversations and opened a lot of doors to work with more people on campus. And finally, you can always schedule a training or schedule a call with me if you want to learn more about how you can use Altmetric Explorer, or if you have a lot of people in the library who would like to learn more, or your researchers, etc. As the Senior Engagement Manager at Altmetric, that's my job. I want to make sure that you know how to use Altmetric Explorer most effectively and efficiently, and so I can always have a chat with you about that. Kind of on that same note, I encourage you to follow us for more learning opportunities. So we have a YouTube channel. You can take a look at our Figshare repository where we have a lot of video trainings, slide decks, just different guides and training materials on our Figshare account. And then we also have an Altmetric podcast. You can look at SoundCloud or iTunes for the Altmetric podcast, which is, I think it's a monthly podcast, and it's very interesting. Each month it is showcasing a piece of research that gained a lot of attention, and an interview with that researcher and discussing, their research and how they think it garnered so much attention in the news, social media, etc. So I think we have a few minutes left for questions. But yes, again, you can always email support@altmetric.com with additional questions or chat with me about it, and I'm happy to discuss more.
Thank you, Patty. That was fantastic. We really appreciate that. I see one question so far, and we can answer that question. If anyone else has a question, please post it in the questions box, and we will have Patty answer it for a couple more minutes, and then we'll end the webinar. So the question that we have, Patty, is from Kamal. He asks, can you put more than one institution in affiliation, the grid search field tab at the same time?
Yeah, so that is, I think I may have answered that question further along in the presentation, but I can go back to, let's see if I can go back to the slide. I believe this is what he is talking about. Yes, so within the advanced search, in this affiliation, you can put multiple institutions in this box. But as I mentioned, they will automatically be OR'd together and not AND'd together. So, so that's something just to keep in mind is if we're looking at collaboration, it's best to do them one at a time. So for broader collaborations between, two or more institutions, that will not, since they are OR'd together instead of AND'd together, it's something to keep in mind. And that's true for authors and verified departments as well. They're automatically OR'd together, not AND'd together. If you wanted to do a more complex search where you're able to use Boolean operators and to AND things together, if you are in biomedicine, there is a PubMed search feature within the advanced search where you can craft a search strategy looking at using PubMed and ANDing things together. Or if you are a customer of Dimensions, stay tuned because we will have, I think, the beginning of October, we will have a new search integration between Dimensions, which is a bibliographic database where you can craft more advanced searches, and Altmetric. So you can craft an advanced search in Dimensions and then view those results within Altmetric. So yes, you can do it, but they're OR'd together, not AND'd together.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. I think this might be our last one that we have time for. But if you want to stay on, and anyone who needs to go, we completely understand. But if you'd like to hear the answers to the questions, please hang with us, and we'll just go for a few more minutes. The next question is how to distinguish good, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me, publicity from bad publicity. I remember a paper in the top 100 Altmetric list that was commented upon a lot because of methodological mistakes. So the high score, but for the wrong, so it had a high score, but for the wrong reasons. So the question was, how do you distinguish good publicity from bad publicity?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and that's something that when I do an introductory Altmetric training, I cover that with an example of context is key. You always want to look at why something is receiving a lot of attention versus just looking at the number, because the altmetric attention score and the number of people, just like with citations, it's just an indication of volume, of how many or how much. But if we look at the actual context around why people are mentioning something, so we can do that with Altmetric. We can take a look at the engagement and why that's happening. It's very important to keep in mind. And I think probably the paper this person is referring to is this paper that had a very high altmetric attention score, but the reason that it was cited so much was because the authors accidentally left in the phrase, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here? And so it was a mistake. It made it through peer review and editing with, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here, and was published. And Twitter, news, social media had a field day with that. So I guess the easy answer for that is there's no way you can tell if something is good just by looking at the number and by looking at how many people have shared something. You actually have to take a look at the context in detail. And that's same with citations as well, right? You don't know if something is a positive or negative citation unless you actually dig into why people are citing something. A good example of that is the infamous Lancet paper linking vaccines and autism. It's been cited 1,500 times, has an altmetric score of over 3,000, but it's obviously not good research. And so people are sharing it because it's not good research. So we always have to look at the context.
Okay. Yeah, we have a lot more questions. I think that they're really coming in. Really quickly, in relation to that affiliation question, like 2 questions ago, shouldn't the My Institution only be clicked?
For this example on the screen here, this is when we're looking at discovering competitive insight. So this is when we want to look at the affiliation. So in this case, University of Michigan, we want to look at Michigan's publications by itself. So everything that they've published that's received altmetric attention, because we're trying to discover that competitive insight to see how our peer institutions are doing and what kind of attention they are receiving. So we're looking at the full altmetric database in that context. But for the previous example, so that was kind of the bonus tip. For the tip about collaborations, then we want to have My Institution only checked and then search in University of Michigan. So then we'll be seeing our papers that we have published with Michigan and those resulting outputs with attention. So those are kind of two different use cases.
Okay. Honestly, I think we got them all. I think that was the last question. Everything else was some very glowing remarks for you, Patty, which I'll share with you later.
Thank you.
Later.
But if anyone else has questions that come up later, feel free to email us. Always happy to have conversations, and especially with librarians, I love to talk about what's going on in your library and how you can use Altmetric most effectively. So always open to having those casual conversations or organizing more structured trainings as well. So thank you everyone for attending.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Patty, thank you for the presentation. Have a great day, everyone.